This is Julian H. Franklin, and we are moving to the 7th of a series of 10 discussions with C. Northcote Parkinson, the distinguished author, historian, and political scientist, on the evolution of political thought and on the political cycle. In our last talk with Dr. Parkinson, you expressed many doubts about the future of democracy, and you said that the trend to dictatorship, which you note in the present age, has begun to cast some very, very important doubts upon the illusion of permanence and inevitability in the march of democracy. Would you care to illuminate that prejudice and your ideas as to why it's becoming an illusion?
I think I'm going to resent this term prejudice.
That prejudice in favor of democracy?
Oh, I thought you were imputing a prejudice to me. I can't allow that. No, I think the way I'd look at it is this. If you'd taken some statesman of, shall we say, Gladstone's period in England, the Victorian age, he'd have said, in the past there were monarchies and empires and aristocracies, but the tendency of the age now, and he'd have been speaking of Europe and America and of the world in general, is towards enlightened democracy. Or I think he'd have said parliamentary rule, perhaps, rather than democracy at that time. And he'd have seen the salvation of the world in terms of registering electors and putting up ballot boxes and candidates standing for election and parliaments settling down to discuss the budget. For a time, that would have been quite plausible. One could have said that 100 years ago, there was scarcely any sort of parliamentary government in that sense. Now, parliamentary government is to be seen in England and in the United States, in France, at least after 1871. You could say that. The beginnings of it in Germany, Austria, Hungary, you could see a whole tendency towards parliamentary rule, one country after another adopting it or taking a step in that direction. You certainly can't say that of the 20th century. You can no longer look upon it as an inevitable progress of all countries moving towards this same form of rule. Instead, you find this quite different picture of a whole lot of countries adopting something entirely different. Several countries adopting parliamentary government and then abolishing it again. And then this long list of countries finding in dictatorship apparently a solution, perhaps a short-term solution to their immediate problems.
Of course, in the etymological sense of the word, dictatorship and monarchy are very close in meaning. I wonder, how do you discriminate the two?
Well, in doing so, I'm following the Greeks. The Greeks had a word for it. And you always find in Greek literature that you have the one man, the basileus, and the other quite different man, the tyrannos. And the difference is in the religious sanction behind the king who has succeeded in accordance with the custom of the country, either by descent or perhaps by election, but at any rate in some established mode and after some prescribed religious form. And the basileus is the man for whom there is a veneration, a religious veneration, as for the rightful ruler. The tyrannos is the man who has made himself ruler by force and cunning. The difference may seem slight to some, but I think it's a useful distinction.
In other words, you mean that the tyrant would be a usurper?
Well, he might be in the sense that he had displaced the rightful king, or he might be in having set himself up as ruler in a state which didn't ordinarily have a king at all. But he'd still be tyrannos.
So that tyrant, as the Greeks use it, doesn't necessarily mean a vicious ruler.
No, he's not necessarily vicious, nor does dictator, in modern usage, at least to me, imply a bad ruler or a tyrannical ruler.
Well, you were saying why do you think the distinction is an important one between tyrant and king?
Yes, well, it turns on this question of religion, really, the religious function of kingship, which is inherent in the nature of it.
I noticed that in almost all of your critical distinctions and explanations, you find religion perhaps the most powerful factor in explaining the changes of the forms of rule.
I'm unconscious of having brought it in frequently, but perhaps I was right to do so.
When would you say that dictatorship begins to appear as a phenomenon, a widespread phenomenon in the modern world?
Well, of course, the word, as you realize, comes from ancient Rome and meant originally an office of a temporary kind, filled to meet a particular emergency. I think the first dictator in the modern world is Oliver Cromwell, where you have the classic form of a monarchy, the king killed, the monarchy swept away, and another man coming into office as ruler, but not king. And you remember with Cromwell, he didn't claim to be king. He didn't take the title. He called himself Lord Protector. And that, in fact, brings out very clearly this distinction between king and dictator.
Well, how did Cromwell conceive his function as Lord Protector? What was he attempting to achieve by assuming this extraordinary power?
Well, I think, like most other dictators, his basic motive was to save his own life. He was a man who, by his military skill, ended off as the successful commander of one side in a civil war. By his skill as a cavalry leader, he won that war. He then lost patience with his colleagues in various ways, whom he thought stupid. In fact, they were. He pushed them aside and made himself ruler. And his first motive in making himself ruler was safety, because he conceived at the start that he and his friends would live in peril as long as the rightful king, Charles I, was alive. So his desire was to kill him, to execute him. He saw to it that that was done.
Well, how does that square with the example of Washington, who was in a similar position, military power, leader of a successful revolution, and declined the dictatorship or refused to seek it? I think we might find other examples from history, but perhaps this one's enough to make my point.
It does make a point, but it brings out the essential difference that Washington was at the head of a very largely united people. He was not the leader of a minority party. He was the leader of, I think we can definitely say, a majority. And he had very little to fear from assassination or judicial murder or anything of the kind. Cromwell was not in that position. He wasn't at the head of a united people, but he was at the head of a successful army. And for him to have retired, to have handed over the government to someone else, would have been death. He knew that.
Well, a dictator, after all, has various ways of achieving his safety in terms of his long-range objectives, in terms of his notion of what the future of the state might be. Couldn't one say that perhaps Cromwell was thinking of his dictatorship as a preparation for democracy?
It's awfully difficult to say that. What we can say with certainty is that Cromwell, whether he knew it or not, was preparing for a return to monarchy. Mm-hmm. And by the time of his death, the whole situation was so obviously pointing towards the restoration of monarchy that it came about by mutual consent with very little friction, very little trouble.
Well, do you think that dictatorship inherently tends to prepare the way for monarchy?
It can very easily do so. Again, I wouldn't represent this as anything inevitable.
I was careful to use the word tend.
Yes, I noticed that. I appreciated that. But it very often produces monarchy. There are many examples of it. And you can see that there are features of it which account for that tendency. First of all, the dictator, by the nature of things, can't retain office for more than his lifetime, so that his rule is going to be temporary in that sense. Well, what's going to happen when the dictator dies? It's most unlikely that there will be another dictator of equal ability, because your first dictator does not, as a rule, like to have people of equal ability, equal military prestige near him. He would rather be surrounded by relative nonentities, the people who will serve, people who are useful. He doesn't want people of equivalent stature around him. And the result is that when he dies, it's most unlikely that there will be some other dictator ready to step into his place. The Chinese had some mechanism for ensuring this, which is rather peculiar to them. In general, the dictator dies and there is a blank. Well, ordinarily you'd say, why not restore some kind of aristocratic government? But again, the dictatorship hasn't prepared people for that. People in general, and after a spell of dictatorship, are not used to governing themselves, either aristocratically or democratically. They're used to being governed. And their tendency, when the dictator dies, is to do two things. Either to restore some earlier monarchy, if there is any chance of doing so, or to take the son of the dictator and say, this is the beginning, in effect, of a new dynasty. And of course, once you've done that, you take the son of the dictator. In France, you take a Napoleon III, the nephew of the original dictator originally. And then, of course, you're going back to the concept of monarchy, but just by a different route.
Well, do you think that Bolivar, whom you regard as one of the origins, at least of the Latin American type of dictator, do you think that he had to take political power or monopolistic power in order to save his life?
I wouldn't say in that case that that was his principal motive. He seems to have been a remarkable man in many ways, and very possibly he didn't even value his life very highly, and there are men who take a broader view, so to speak, and are not as worried about their skins as Cromwell was. But there, I think, you get a situation which seems insoluble in any other way. Bolivar tended to get sort of pushed back into office by the mere absence of any body of people or any alternative ruler who would take his place. That may be another way in which dictatorship is perpetuated.
He had the feeling, in other words, that the Venezuelan people or the Colombian people were not yet ready for democracy. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they clearly weren't.
Yes, that was the grounds of his taking the dictatorship.
Oh, I think so, yes.
Couldn't we distinguish dictatorships as between, let's say, revolutionary and counter-revolutionary? For example, isn't there a tremendous difference between the aims of a Robespierre and the aims of a Franco? And for that matter, as between a Lenin and a Mussolini. And wouldn't perhaps these differences in objectives lead to differences in organization, technique, and ideology?
You might think that they would, but in practice I don't see that they do very much. I distinguish from the beginning between the dictator who is, say, the leader of the working class or the leader of a depressed body of the people. Julius Caesar was that originally. Rather, he played that game a bit, although he very soon found other bases for power. And, of course, you have the other kind, the reactionary dictator, the man who is leader of the oligarchs, the more prosperous party. And they are different in origin, I quite agree, and you might expect them to behave very differently. But, in fact, it's the circumstances of dictatorship which dictate what they're to do. I agree that there can be differences in character, but the basic facts of dictatorship still remain. First, that the office was achieved in the first place usually by violence. There might be some instances to the contrary, but it's usually been violently created as a form of rule. Second, that it can't last longer than the life of the man who's holding it, and mayn't last as long, and incidentally his life may not be terminated in the natural way in any case. The people sometimes anticipate that, shorten the process. That's not unknown in the story of dictatorships, so that it's a short-lived form of rule. And there you have two basic considerations. And the third one, which is again common to any form of dictatorship, is this difficulty of replacing it by something else, the dictator's difficulty in stepping down.
But in Russia, of course, there was a relatively smooth transition from Stalin to Malenkov to Khrushchev. Doesn't that cast doubt upon this principle of the dictator being unable to transmit power to a successor?
I've always considered the Russian experience as proof that that is not a dictatorship. I know there are people who would disagree with me, but in writing about it, I've classed the Russian experiment as one in theocracy, or rule of a priesthood. And the way some writers have certainly considered the matter is this, that the actual power in Russia after Lenin's time came into the hands of a strong group of bureaucrats, party leaders, chiefs of police, and other powerful men. And they discovered that for purposes of propaganda, for purposes of focusing the loyalty of the people at large, they had to choose one of themselves and build him up in a public relations sense, build him up as a character, put his picture before the people as that of the actual leader of the state. And I think that is, in fact, what happened to Stalin.
Well, perhaps I can illustrate my point from the history of Rome. Julius Caesar, of course, was assassinated, but primarily because he tried to make the transition to monarchy a bit too quickly, too. But Augustus, Caesar's nephew, was successful in transmitting power, and for about 100 or 200 years, the regime still seemed to be a dictatorship, and not quite yet a monarchy, and yet power was constantly transmitted, not always peaceably, with some violence on occasion, and yet institutionally transmitted from one dictator to another.
Yes, it was rather a checkered career there. For a time it seemed that the thing was hereditary, or if not hereditary, that it was within a certain family, with a certain latitude as to who the successor was to be. And then it sort of changed at intervals after that into the hands of one victorious general after another. And they seem to have solved the matter from the Roman point of view almost in the Russian manner when one considers it, by making the emperor divine. That happened fairly soon in the process when the emperor was deified and people sacrificed before the emperor's statue.
Yes, but only after his death, of course. And real theocracy probably doesn't begin until a somewhat later period.
Yes, but that sort of gave a religious sanction to the whole thing, and they seem to have managed to create a continuity in the imperial office, which managed to override the shifting as between one dynasty and another, one family of another, actually in power.
You know, the German sociologist Max Weber has said that almost all dictatorships are charismatic, and by that he meant that the leader somehow seems to have the grace of God, the magic in him. In that sense, couldn't you say that perhaps all dictatorships are proto-theocratic anyway? I would cite as an example Hitler.
Yes, he certainly thought that he had a sort of inspiration and that he embodied in himself the spirit of the German people. But of course it still doesn't get over the question of when he dies. There was no successor to Hitler. There was no successor in sight. Hitler didn't even think there was a successor.
But yet the German dictatorship, you said, was in some sense quasi-theocratic. But are you then dealing with a case in which there was a theocracy which didn't quite permit succession easily?
I don't think that it was a very successful theocracy. I think the Russian one is far more so. And the way that power has changed hands there without civil war and changed hands successively seems to me to show that there is a greater strength in the group that runs the Communist Party in Russia than in any one individual in it.
Can you give us some examples of cases where succession proved impossible?
Yes. I don't know whether Napoleon I is a good case there or not. He was certainly a very difficult man to succeed, even had he not been defeated. There was no obvious way of continuing the reign, although he was struggling to make it a hereditary monarchy. That's what he wanted it to be.
Hitler and Mussolini was never tested in their case. Where has it been tested?
Cromwell is one. I'm afraid I haven't followed all the South American dictatorships.
Yes,
that's a very confused story.
Bolivar, in a quotation you've taken from him, makes the point that it's people rather than systems that promote tyranny. That quotation seemed to be in an improving context.
I'm afraid I don't remember the context. You've read this book more recently than I have.
Oh, about 20 minutes ago.
Yes, well, that puts you in a strong position. Bolivar certainly felt that the people wanted his dictatorship and needed his dictatorship, and that was his justification for carrying on with it.
I think his context there was that it's the moral qualities of a population, in the last analysis, as opposed merely to the social and political mechanisms which determines whether a country is going to have freedom or tyranny.
Yes, well, that's quite arguable, but as an historian, I'm always very dubious about lending weight to this idea of national character. It's so easy to end off saying, well, the Germans have no real gift for governing themselves, therefore they must always have a monarchy or a dictatorship and are going to be unhappy under anything else. Or you could say that the Irish are such a turbulent lot of people that you'd never expect them to form a stable government. And you can go on trying to think what the moral or natural qualities are of peoples. And I'm never very happy about that. I'm much happier if I can find some real circumstances which are more beyond question than that. If you can find economic and physical and geographical circumstances, I'm much happier than talking about the innate moral qualities of the people of Bolivia, because that seems to me far more difficult to assess.
I'd like to throw out one more to you. The term dictatorship, as you said, comes from Rome. Dictator. A dictatorship there was a regular office of the state. Would you call an office of that sort a dictatorship? And would you say that the emergency powers exercised by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, or perhaps Brüning in Germany from 1930 to 32, made them dictators?
No, I wouldn't strictly. I think that in particular circumstances, someone who has come into power by perfectly constitutional means has to assume rather greater power for the period of an emergency. I'm sure that Winston Churchill was a far more powerful prime minister than his predecessors. I'm sure that he was able to take far greater responsibilities on his own shoulders.
And say during the war had practically dictatorial powers.
It was of the war period that I was speaking.
Yes.
And I'd say there perhaps dictatorial is putting it too strongly. But he certainly had quite unusual powers. I imagine the same could be said of Roosevelt, and the same of Stalin, incidentally, although people on this side of the Iron Curtain have been perhaps reluctant to see that Stalin's power in Russia was as likely to arise from the situation as Churchill's power in Britain. I don't regard that as of the same order of things as the actual seizure of power in a period of disorder.
So that the concept of usurpation becomes decisive for you. Of course, the Middle Ages had a dual concept of dictatorship or tyranny. One came from the absence of a title, which would cover usurpation, and the other by the way it exercised its power. Would you use the category tyrant, dictatorship for a monarch who had violated the principle of law or the moral basis of his authority?
Well, you may remember how in Henry V, Shakespeare makes his king say, "I am no tyrant but a Christian king," showing that the concept of the tyrant as contrasted with the lawful king was present in people's minds. And I think that the Middle Ages made the concept more easy in the sense that the wicked king could be excommunicated by the church and so have his particular religious sanction of monarchy removed from him. And I think that the monarch who was so excommunicated did in fact lose a great deal of his authority by that excommunication.
In a rather cryptic passage, you said that without an earlier period of monarchy, sometimes, the later development of democracy may be impossible. You were thinking of South America. You felt at that point that in view of endless cycle of dictatorships in South America, they might have done better to start with a monarchy.
What I had in mind there was the creation of the unit within which an aristocracy or a democracy can be created. Let's put it this way. In a democracy, the rule depends on a counting of heads, deciding how many people want this and how many want that, and it ends in some sort of a vote. Now, you can't vote until the area within which the voting is to take place has been defined. This is very much in my mind at the moment because Malaya is a case in point, the country with which I've been familiar for some years. Now there has come into being a new state with various groups of people living in it. Now the relative strength of those groups depends very much where you draw the frontier. And until that frontier has been drawn, the voting is meaningless. In fact, it's impracticable. Now, in that particular case, the island of Singapore is not now part of the Federation of Malaya. If it were part, if you adjust the frontier to include it, there's another 1.5 million Chinese thrown into the scales, tipping them quite definitely as against the Malays. Now, at an earlier stage in the history of the same country, the Chinese, in fact, had a majority on the peninsula itself, merely because the frontier was then drawn further south. In other words, take the area as a whole, the question of whether there is a Chinese or a Malay majority depends very much on where you draw the line. What is the actual area in which the voting, or in this case the population distribution, is to be counted? Now, it's the same in any state where there is any question of where the thing begins or ends. Take the British Isles. In that small area there were originally some 6 languages, and there are quite obviously, and to this day, these distinct peoples. You have the English, properly speaking, of England, you have the Welsh of Wales, the Scottish in Scotland, and they rather divided between the Highlanders and Lowlanders, and then you have the Irish over the way in Ireland, and various other odd islands with people like the Manxmen, and so on. Well, when it comes to trying to create a parliamentary form of rule, the composition of the government depends very much on what is to be included. Supposing you have the question, should Wales have home rule? Should it be self-governing? It's a question that somebody might easily be raising someday. You try to solve that by democratic means. Well, who's to do the voting? You take a vote in Wales, and there we'll say you get a majority for people saying we want our own government. But then it's arguable. Why take the vote only in Wales? Why shouldn't it be a vote in England and Wales to decide whether the English think that the Welsh ought to have self-government? Then the Scottish come into it. Well, should it be a vote of the British Isles as to whether Wales should be self-governing? Now, the function of monarchy in many cases has been, in fact, to carve out a particular area, a kingdom, as called originally, and say this is a political unit, it is defined by these frontiers, it is characterized by this language, this is a kingdom. And once the kingdom has become fixed in that sense, Portugal, shall we say, Portugal might quite easily have been part of Spain. Historically, it's come out to be the Kingdom of Portugal, which it then becomes possible for someone to come along later and say this is the Republic of Portugal, and now the Dictatorship of Portugal, eventually, someday. You can call it the democracy, perhaps, of Portugal. But all those processes seem to me impossible until someone has first of all created Portugal. Mm-hmm. And that has usually fallen to a king.
Well, it usually isn't the kind of problem that you solve by a conscious decision. It's the result of centuries and centuries of history. That is the definition of the area of a state. But in India and in the United States, the decision was made on a democratic basis, wasn't it? The decision, for example, to separate Pakistan and India, as well as the definition of boundaries in the original.
Well, was that made in a democratic way? That was a British decision as the only way to do anything.
I think there was an agreement between the Muslim League and the Congress Party, wasn't there?
There was a certain agreement between parties, but that's not the same thing as being a plebiscite of the people.
Oh, yes. Well, of course, I agree with you on
And
that.
if you'd come to a plebiscite of the people, then you get the question who is to vote. And that is where, incidentally, in India, And I'm glad you brought that case up, because there you have this case of
Kashmir. No.
which is sort of in between the two. Now, how can you solve the Kashmir problem by democratic means?
Well, they might revert temporarily to monarchy to get it solved and then go back again.
They might do that. It's not a democratic means of solving the problem.
Are there any grounds for thinking that perhaps this wave of dictatorship that we've been witnessing is only temporary, and perhaps the drawing back for a new spring forward?
All dictatorships are temporary in their nature, and it's a phase that one would expect not to last very long. One would have thought that the Second World War represented a triumph for the democracies over the dictatorships of Germany and Italy, and that should have spelt the end of dictatorship, and that democracy would have been shown to have been more efficient, even at fighting, and that the tendency would then have been back to parliamentary rule. But that hasn't happened. Since the Second World War, more dictatorships have come into being.
From what you've said, dictatorship seems to be an awfully promising career for a young man. If you had to do it all over again, how would you go about establishing yourself in a hypothetical country, and what would your expectations be?
That's a very interesting question. You'll probably notice from now on a difference in my voice. Instead of the bland tones of a professor, you'll begin to hear the sharp bark of one accustomed to giving orders to cringing thousands. Well, let's start off with the situation in a country where there has been increasing disorders of various kinds, conflicts between different groups of socialists and reactionaries, and eventually end in civil strife, actual fighting of some kind. Now, I have had the opportunity of seeing a town in the hands of rioting mobs for as long as 48 hours. The one thing that's clear about that sort of situation is that someone, sooner or later, has to give the order to fire. And people are awfully unwilling to do that. They feel that if they give the order to fire, they may become terribly unpopular, and quite apart from that, they may get disowned by their own side. You know, that's always rather the nightmare of the army officer, that he'll be called in aid of the civil power, and he has this uneasy feeling that if he shoots, he'll be tried for murder, and if he doesn't shoot, he'll be court-martialed for dereliction of duty. So one way and another, he can't do right. But on the whole, where the situation is really bad, it's better to shoot. And we've all been taught at some stage or another that if you shoot to kill. None of this business of firing over the heads of the crowd, which merely kills innocent people 2 miles away. Instead of that, you fire into the crowd. The particular riots that I saw, after going on for 2 days, were completely dispersed by firing approximately 20 rounds, which was all that had ever been needed. Well, let's suppose that all this has been going on, and that I am a commander who is in a situation such as Napoleon was in Paris on one celebrated occasion, when the other side is rioting about the center of the city, and he issues his orders in Napoleonic terms, naturally, and he says, fire. And he opened fire with artillery. He was a man to stop at nothing. Anyway, he was a gunner. So he gave them the works, if I may be allowed to use that expression, and we'll suppose that I've done the same, and found myself dictator on the following morning, which is more or less what happened to him. Some people are very grateful to me for having brought the strife to an end. Other people are regarding me with considerable hatred. These are the types whose relatives have been shot down in the open streets, and they take rather a poor view of it. They think it's a bad show. Well, the result is that I'm in power, and I find straight away that it doesn't suit me very well to have very able commanders immediately round me. The trouble with there is one of prestige, that you get a general who's as good as you are, and on some occasion he may possibly make you feel small. He may know more than you do. he may win a victory and come back in triumph at a time when possibly your troops have been less successful. Well, that would never do at all. So I start by removing all the generals of obvious ability. Some of them are advised that their time for retirement has come. Others have unfortunate accidents of one kind or another, these things that befall people, and others are sent off to command in distant garrisons where no fighting is expected. And then I get the army and the forces generally completely under my control. My own immediate followers, loyal types, not much brains perhaps, but loyal, are given command in various places, and then I feel that I'm pretty safely in command of the whole thing. I find I need some brains round about, and I need them for propaganda. I'd look round Madison Avenue for some suitable types to recruit on the propaganda side. Public relations, they're very important these days. And so we could have some brainy people of that kind. There would be no risk of their superseding me, of course. They wouldn't have that sort of personality. So there we're beginning to get the situation properly under control. Now, my dangers would be that if everything was very calm and prosperous and peaceful for a long period, people would begin to wonder what they had a dictator for. You know, after all, it's a thing for a period of crisis. So on the whole, we needed a recurring crisis of some kind in order to justify dictatorship. Crises can be of various types, but the commonest kind is of war. And of course, the best war is against an obviously inferior opponent whom you can defeat economically, exaggerate the numbers of the enemy considerably, and come home once more in triumph, and have one of those plebiscites where you obtain 97% of the vote instead of the 95% of the original plebiscite that brought you into power. I think we'd probably have one or two minor conflicts of that kind. They'd be minor in fact, but quite considerable when they appeared in the press and over the radio. And then people would all turn to themselves and say, how fortunate that we have a military genius of the first order as our ruler, who brings us safely through these dangerous and dreadful crises. So all the time prestige would be mounting, and there'd be very particular attention given to cinema. A lot can be done with cinema. I seem to remember films of Mussolini in the 1930s when he was being filmed without realizing it. And he was talking quite like a human being to various people around him. Suddenly he became aware of the camera. He stiffened into a dictatorial posture. His jaw thrust out. His arms were folded. And he looked sternly before him. And everyone in the cinema where I was roared with laughter. At any rate, it showed the way you have to pose in front of the camera, and dictators sort of learn that. And they also usually manage to censor the film afterwards to make certain that there are no unfortunate episodes of that kind, of being photographed from the wrong angle at the wrong moment. That will never do. So we go on for a time. Now, what goes wrong with this? Well, one trouble is on this question of eliminating all these other able types who may have been round, and the other one arises from the propaganda. These are the two aspects of it, the elimination of the fit and the propaganda to support the regime. Now, the trouble about the elimination of the fit is that I've gradually surrounded myself, unconsciously, with an awful lot of people whose only ability is in saying what I want them to say. And so whatever I do, they all rally round and applaud loudly and say, splendid fellow, there's no one like our Führer, our Duce. He's the man to meet every crisis. And they all applaud furiously all the time, and each time they do, they receive some promotion, some fresh decoration, some fresh order or medal on the chest. And this goes on all very well for a time, and so does the propaganda. The snag about the propaganda is that sooner or later I come to believe in it. I don't know whether this happens to advertising people after they've, for a long time, been plugging some particular soap, whether they really come to think that this soap is better than any other. Possibly it does. It certainly seems to happen to dictators. They come to believe their own propaganda, and at last, perhaps by accident, they drift into war against a more serious opponent. And there's the mischief, because to start with, I'm surrounded by all these completely useless people whose only ability is in applauding me. To make matters worse, they're so terrified by this stage that they don't tell me the truth. So as the campaign proceeds, they come back with reports of imaginary victories, and by that time I've so believed my propaganda of invincibility that I believe them, and their casualties are disguised, the numbers of the enemy are minimized, and I end up with a completely false impression of what is going on, and by this time I'm, to all intents and purposes, off my head, because I'm living in a private world of my own in which everything goes just as I think it should. All my cronies are coming round telling me that the situation is just what I want it to be, and at the same time one division after another is being massacred by the other side, and no one has even yet come in to tell me that the formation no longer exists. And so I end off in this sort of wonderful position in some bomb-proof dugout, surrounded by maps, and on the maps are put symbols representing Army Corps divisions, navies, and units of air forces. And I'm issuing my Napoleonic instructions. People are running around moving the flags about the map, representing formations that were wiped out the week before, but no one has dared to tell me. And the general effect is highly impressive, but completely unreal. And I'm probably interrupted in the middle of it by finally the sound of shell fire coming nearer and nearer, and I realize, as Hitler did, that the moment has come to end it all.
Well, at least you didn't face the problem of succession.
No, I didn't get as far as that.
But of course, if you could have escaped, I should think you would have had a brilliant career on the stage.
Well, the trouble is with dictators, they don't seem to escape. I think many of them might in fact have had a brilliant career on the stage.
Well,
I've sometimes wished they'd had a brilliant career in the stage instead.
Well, perhaps we have something here. After all, Hitler was a frustrated painter. Mussolini was a newspaper editor. Well, I was going to turn to a rather serious note. You've alerted us to a point which I think ought to be taken very seriously, that it's a little bit too simple to say dictator equals bad, democracy equals good. And you make the point that sometimes dictators perform useful functions. In some vague sense, one might use the word good.
Venizelos was very greatly admired as ruler of Greece, and I think most people would agree that he was a dictator. Mustafa Kemal is, I think, without question, Kemal Ataturk, as he was called, the founder of modern Turkey. Most of its importance in the world, I think, today can be traced to him, and most Turks would probably agree to that. Very few people have anything much to say against Dr. Salazar, the present dictator of Portugal, who has ruled Portugal very quietly and unobtrusively for a great number of years, and apparently with perfect success. I think one could find many other examples.
What circumstances would you say are required for a dictatorship to be good?
Well, it's partly the character of the dictator, partly, I think, the amount of consent that he could command to his rule in the first instance. If there was a fairly universal demand for dictatorship, I think that the prospects of a reasonable kind of dictatorship are very much better. For example, I don't know whether de Gaulle is going to prove a distinguished and useful ruler of France. I don't even know whether he can be classed as a dictator. But I think it could be said with truth that the general desire of the people of France was for him to assume the power, and that helps him a great deal, that he's not compelled to use great force to maintain his power in the first instance. He has a very considerable degree of consent and sympathy from the governed. All that would seem to point to the possibility of a prosperous and uncontested period of power.
Do you think that under the conditions that existed in Germany at the time, that even a Hitler with a good character could have been, quote, a good dictator?
I think it's not impossible. And in fact, in his early days, Hitler had probably several points in his favor. He was certainly very able in various ways, and I think perhaps someone of a different character might have produced a result less disastrous to the world at large. On the other hand, Hitler was peculiarly fitted to gain and maintain power in the situation as it was. And the doubt always crosses the mind whether the man we'd think of as a potentially good dictator could in fact have attained the office and kept it.
The very fact that Germany had such a deep experience with democracy.
Deep? What do you think of as deep?
Well, you had a very strongly organized democratic movement in Germany.
Ah, yes, but over a very short period.
Yes. Of course, the Social Democratic Party goes back to the 1870s.
It goes back to the 1870s, but as a successful party in power, its period was very short.
Shall we put it this way? With a intensively organized industrial society in which organized groups can play such a large role,
yes,
is there any other way of maintaining dictatorial power except by total suppression and all the techniques of totalitarianism? That was the point I was raising about Germany.
I think there probably are ways today, but they seem to me more sinister. I think that the developments of modern psychology, modern advertising, radio, television, cinema, state-controlled education, all the means of influencing opinion, put into the actual government in power, whatever it is, an extraordinary and unprecedented power for influencing opinion, so that you will end with the situation of the dictatorship by consent, but by a consent which has been worked up by this extremely efficient and modern technique of mass persuasion.
Well, as we look around at the temporary state of democracy, noticing no very powerful movements for social change, either in England or the United States, perhaps there isn't enough revolutionary spirit and democracy to make a dictatorship necessary anymore.
That may be so. In fact, I hope that it is so.
This would be a triumph of the American consumer, perhaps. They're too busy with television to worry about trying to change the power structure.
Yes, there are dangers even in that. You could end off with a whole country so hypnotized by shadows on screens as to be divorced from reality altogether.
With a few couches, we could get along very nicely.
Yes, you end up a sort of punch-drunk people who are more or less like drug addicts. I think there are dangers in this.
We started with the East, and nirvana is a concept of the East, and perhaps your political cycle will end with a new technologically produced nirvana. That'll be the end of it.
Yes, I think this is a new cycle of your own invention. Now, you'll have to explain that.
Perhaps we could say this, that there are periods in history in which profound changes in social structure are taking place, seem always to produce dictatorship as one class replaces another. Perhaps if we look upon the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th century as dictatorships associated with the rise of the middle classes, perhaps we're going through only a similar temporary phase associated with the rise of the working classes.
You could do that, but I don't agree that the working classes have risen. The period of parliamentary rule, the period of votes, the period when all hopes were pinned on general elections and ballot boxes, was very much a period of the working classes. It was exactly the period when the world's destinies seemed to be settled by large conscript armies, the strength of which was to be measured in the number of their bayonets. That age has passed, and on the whole, the workman of those days in the present century has mattered less and less. In industry, the skilled workman, the trades unionist, has got pushed out by the organization man, the managerial class on the one side, and the unskilled laborer. He matters less than ever before. Matters certainly less than he did during the last century.
And yet this wave of dictatorship has not, in the long run, certainly, reversed this tendency to socialism, which must in some way improve the social position of the working class.
Well, it may do that, but the power structure in the present century is one peculiarly suitable for dictatorship, because the actual physical force in a country has come to be concentrated in a way that's far more easy to control than in the days of massed armies. A few tanks, a few machine guns, a few squadrons of jet bombers and fighters, backed up by the forces of radio and television, by all the forces of propaganda which are at the command of a modern ruler, make it far easier to concentrate power in the hands of a dictator or a small group of people, and far more difficult to disperse that power among the people at large. I think technologically the 19th century formed a good background for growing parliamentary rule. I think that technologically the 20th century does not form a good background for that form of rule. It seems to lend rather a different aspect to the matter. It seems to prepare the way for dictatorship.
The only question, then, I suppose, is not whether the trend to dictatorship exists, but how long it will continue. In our next discussion, Dr. Parkinson, I should like to ask you about what seems to be the most stable of modern dictatorships, the Soviet Union. For you've already indicated that you have some very special notions about its nature as a theocratic system. I should like to hear more about that next time.